as I promised, we would have back with us the author of The Ark Secret, Jerry Bowen. He is the director of Anchor Stones International, and the field of his endeavor has been biblical archaeology. He has been involved in this for well more than 30 years, starting out as a critic, as a skeptic, and continuing to delve into the evidence. He is bringing forth so many great details, especially concerning Noah's Ark. This is where we started last week. Noah's Ark has been found in northern Turkey. It is a well-established fact that is ignored in just about all the world and will be continued to be ignored for some time. But I believe that this time is the day that these things are going to come out. The rocks are indeed crying out from the earth. And before the revealing of the Ark of the Covenant, there are things that are getting set up right now. And as Jerry and I were talking about these things, I told him that the first time I saw the evidences concerning this, concerning Noah's Ark and Sodom and Gomorrah, the Red Sea crossing, when I saw these things, I thought, why has this not gone like wildfire through the Christian church? And there's a question that I asked. I was asking heaven, why is it? And I realized it was my responsibility to help get this message out. But, I really never did that much concerning Noah's Ark because I have never been there. I have not been on the site. I've seen the evidence, not all of it, but this is a man who's been there more than 30 times, who has spent a great deal of his life and his own personal resources and the help of so many people to get this message out. But the question comes up, why did God use one man to reveal these things? Jerry, thanks for being back with us.
Yes.
And I really appreciate the work that you've done on this. And I want to hear more about Noah's Ark, more of the evidence on that. But give us your perspective of what has happened. Why is it that one man was used for this rather than a big denomination or a school of archaeology?
Yeah, Michael, that's a great question, and one that really every person should be asking that is exposed to this material. And of course, the question that I ask myself as well, why just one person? How could one person, it'd be phenomenal for one person to find even one of these sites. What I would think of would be, a whole team, a whole university team of folks would be involved, be a lot of resources behind, those individuals, etc. Why is it played out this way? That was a question that I had, and one that we should consider.
Because that's one thing. Well, how could that happen? They say, because that happened, so many people think, because that happened, one man found all these things, it can't be true.
It can't be true.
That's the first premise that comes up. Yeah,
that's obviously one perspective that you can take. The other perspective that I would hope that a Christian would take would be, is God in some way specifically involved with this? Is he doing something specific to demonstrate that he himself is stepping into the equation, you see? And
so it's not a denominational authentication. It's not a school that they're the greatest school on earth. Yeah. And Ron, I knew him too, and he was never applauded himself, not a bit. He used every evidence that he ever got to reach the lowest of people.
Yeah, Jeremiah 9 talks about, makes the statement that, not by might, not by power, but by my spirit, saith the Lord. Yeah. It wasn't going to be that we were so smart, we were going to find things and figure things out. It wasn't human initiative that was going to get this ball rolling about 30 years ago. It was going to be God stepping into the equation specifically, and he was going to have to make that obvious. And that's what that's the message that really has come down to me. He's made it very obvious. We know, humanly speaking, that one person could never find these multitude of things. Okay, right, they would have to be God directed. And when you look at the evidence, you can tell that the evidence is sound enough that if you look objectively, you know that the sites are authentic. There have been a lot of traditional sites out there over the years that have been suggested. But here's physical evidence that verifies the authentic location. So you can try to look the other way, when something's in front of you. But, of course, then you're just being willingly ignorant. And that might be because you have so much invested. For example, a lot of people think that the Ark of Noah came down on Mount Ararat. Well, a lot of people have so much invested in that ideology that to all of a sudden say, well, actually, we see now this evidence and we realize that this is the final resting place. Ego is involved, pride is involved, maybe economics are involved, monetary.
Hunting for Noah's Ark has become an industry for some individuals. People, donate thousands and tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars for them to look for Noah's Ark in a place that didn't even exist in the time of Noah, and it's become a cottage industry. And the first thing they have to do is attempt to attack the real thing, because it would ruin the thing that they built, that they get to go on great vacations and live in mansions off what people have donated.
Yeah. So I think to answer your question directly, there have been a lot of folks that have a lot invested in some way in a different location, and so to all of a sudden change their perspective is maybe a little too difficult. Now, of course, we're still praying for people, and I I have an expectation. I don't have any expectation that someone's just going to accept it because I'm saying it. You have to have a healthy skepticism about some of these things. Archaeology in general is it's highly suspect, because in secular archaeology, for example, you go into a dig, you go to a dig site and you start to go down, and as you go down, you find things, you find the way things are positioned, you look at all the circumstances around that, and that begins to tell a story, right? Well, as you dig deeper, the story is going to expand. In fact, it may even change totally the further down that you dig. And some people obviously have had the integrity to when they realize that, they make the adjustments in the story. The advantage that a biblical archaeologist has is that the story has already been written. Okay?
That's right.
And so the story's already been written, and so when we come along and find things at certain locations that Scripture may verify and identify, and what those things should be, such as in the case of Sodom and Gomorrah, the Bible tells us exactly what we should find, even though there was a great conflagration there. When we find those things, all they're doing is verifying the story that's already been written. We don't have to really add to the story, except for maybe the spiritual significance of it. And that's an important part of course, all of what that we're dealing with. But a lot of people, of course, shy away from some of this or view it critically, because they can't get past the idea that God would use one man to relocate. The stuff has always been there. And God has had it preserved. And now to bring it forth at the appropriate time in history, the best way to do that, to demonstrate that He alone was going to be responsible for that, was to use a single person, and a non-professional at that, you see.
Let's talk about Gideon in the light of it. Here's a non-professional. He's hiding from the Midianites. I mean, he's hiding, sifting his wheat and blowing the chaff away. I mean, this guy is not the warrior out there in front of everyone's face. Sure, exactly. And so how did the Almighty use him? I mean, that was a winnowing down to a very few.
Yeah, as many people recount the story, when Gideon stepped into the leadership position, 32,000 people responded to that call that was sent out. And yet, God knew two things. He knew that He was going to give the victory. The victory was sure. But He also knew that He couldn't allow all those people that were willing, He could not allow them to go up against even though their army was outnumbered, still 4.5 to 1, He couldn't allow that multitude of people to go into battle against the Midianites. And so He started to systematically step it down. In fact, what was interesting about the story is that Gideon was well aware of I call it the Israeli military code that is listed in Deuteronomy chapter 8, the first 8 verses, where it talks about the requirements. The priest would always have to make a declaration before anybody went into service. If you were recently married, you were exempt. If you had planted a garden, you were exempt. If you had built a house, you were exempt. Or if you were afraid, you see. Right. And so
you're afraid to go into battle? We don't need you. We don't want you. Right. Please stay home.
Yeah, so Gideon had failed to make that declaration. And God kind of tapped him on the shoulder and He said, Gideon, you need to make the proclamation. So when he made that proclamation, 22,000 people walked away. I mean, that's a lot. That's a lot of planning and building.
A lot of people just got married, or they're just playing cowards and don't want to admit it.
Well, 22,000 people walked away. And so, but God said to him, he said, I'm not finished yet. He said, march them down to the river and I will test them. And of course, we know the story, how they go down to the river, and 300 walk through the river, just cupping the water in their hands as they go, expecting perhaps to make an immediate assault on the enemy, while the other people taking off their stuff and getting down and lapping up the water, no urgency at all. And so these were the people that God said, I'm going to use them. Mm-hmm. Now, why did he get so specific with that? Well, the reason is he was going to ask of them something totally insane from a military standpoint. He was going to ask them to not covertly go in and try to be picking off the Midianites, a little at a time.
Yeah, not 300 snipers.
Snipers, right. He was going to ask them to go into battle with a trumpet, da-da-da-da-da-da, here I am, and a torch, I'm right here. You can just imagine, I can just imagine Gideon just telling his guys, okay, here's your weaponry. Here's your torch, here's your trumpet, and at the appropriate time, we're gonna scatter around the hillside, and we're gonna make a lot of noise and show them where we are. and see, God whittled that number down from a human standpoint to an impossible scenario. Well, that's kind of what's happened with this discovery material. He whittled things down. He on purpose, intentionally used a non-professional, one single person primarily, to relocate, to go, God said, go here, go here, go here. And he had miraculous experiences.
And it was literally being led by the Spirit. When you hear the testimony, and both of us, we spent a lot of time with Ron Wyatt. I mean, personally, we've heard every one of these stories, and they don't change. They're always the same because he just plain told the truth.
Exactly.
And so you hear these stories, and you hear this is a testimony of how the Spirit led him. Sure. You can't make this stuff up. And one of the things that I would say, the thing that hit me because that question came to me before anyone else said, how could one man find it? Right. I asked that question.
Sure.
And then immediately it came. This is a man who kept the Sabbath. And see, for me, I had only at that point for a year had been keeping the Sabbath. I grew up in the grace perversion, sure. That, the commandments are, done away with basically, et cetera, all except, tithing. That's the only commandment that hasn't been done away with in my church. Right. And in going to movies and dancing, those commandments were still in effect. Mm-hmm. Those ones that came from Mount Sinai. Anyway, but for me, I saw that when I began keeping the Sabbath, it was a life-changing event that the Almighty met me there, and he took me on a path after that. And so as soon as that said, this man kept the Sabbath, then this is what Yeshua said. If you do not keep and do the commandments, if you do not do what you know, even that which you know will be taken away from you. Mm-hmm. You obey what you know, and then if you do obey, even more truth will be given to you. Sure. And so here was the immediate testimony to me. I'm to listen to this man because the Almighty can use one person who obeys his commandments, who will listen to him, and it doesn't matter what happens to them personally. He stood his ground and said, this is what the Almighty showed me. This is how he showed me.
Yeah. And God was, of course, calling, when it comes to something, the most controversial of the sites, the Ark of the Covenant, God needed an eyewitness to that. Yeah. And so much easier to deal with one person in that regard than, a whole crowd of people, etc. So there are many logical reasons why God did it the way he did it, but primarily to demonstrate that he alone had basically just taken control of the situation. And of course, I don't know if we have a chance to really discuss why these particular stories, why the remains of Noah's Ark, why the ashen remains of Sodom and Gomorrah.
Well, maybe we can do that in future times.
Sure.
And especially concerning the Ark of the Covenant, because the revealing of the Ark of the Covenant, this is the biggest thing. And for both of us, it was the hardest to believe, to just, to begin to fathom the spiritual depth of this very thing is far beyond even the simplest things, which is a Noah's Ark. Now, this is a place you've been to many times. Let's start with there, and we can pick up some of this stuff in the future months. Hopefully, we'll get to it before the revealing of the Ark.
Okay. What we've got on the screen here is an aerial photograph that was taken during 1959. You probably heard of the Gary Powers incident where he was shot down, where he was taking high altitude surveillance of that area. And this is one of the photos here. And when the cartographers were looking at it locally in that area, they said, wow, this was Captain de Rupenaar. That's why it's sometimes called, that area is sometimes called the de Rupenaar site. But Captain de Rupenaar was looking at this photo and he said, wow, that looks like a ship. And so they sent this over to a foremost authority in photogrammetry, and that was Arthur Brandenburger at Ohio State University. And he got to looking at it and he said, wow, he said, in all my years, I've never seen a photo that looks more convincing. This is definitely a ship. But what is it doing in the mountains? And so once word started getting around to certain circles, there was quite an interest in this particular location. And a year later is when a team of people, Brandenburger being included, Captain de Rupenaar being included, where they all, I think it was maybe a dozen people, ended up going out to the site. Now they didn't have any roads, and this was of course one of those piles of rocks that we talked about last week. This was where one of those piles of rocks led Ron 17 years later out to the same route. But actually, he went a different way. He went down the Silk Road, if you're familiar with that part of Turkey, as compared to just going over to a military base and being led out by horseback, which is what the Vandeman expedition did. They went to a military base at the foot of the mountain, and horseback took them the rest of the way up there. So, so this occurred in 1959, this photo. In 1960, they had an expedition out there. And then 17 years later, Ron is looking for this same location here. And he finds it after God had marked it with that pile of rocks where he stopped the taxi. And Ron finds this site out there. It's interesting that a year after, yeah, this gives you, this shot right here gives you a before and after the 1978 earthquake. You know, once Ron ended up going there, he saw something similar to the top photo. That's what he looked at first. And then he was praying, you know, Lord, what can we do with this? How can we more definitively reveal that this is the remains of that massive ship? And so while contemplating all of that, I guess God decided to do his own excavation and caused an earthquake in 1978, which dropped the soil significantly. One of the things...
everything right from the sides of the ship literally fell off to where they could see the petrified rib timbers on the side of it even.
We did happen to do kind of a topical excavation here where we just scraped the matrix. So we scraped the matrix off of this, and what it revealed, because every winter you have, this is in the northern hemisphere, so every winter you have snows covering this, and you have, of course, ice and rain, frost. Yeah, so you have frost wedging taking place, and so a little bit of this every year starts to disintegrate and fracture. But when you scrape off the matrix, get all that loose stuff off of there, this is what you end up with here.
So we see
very definitive.
Light and dark, vertical, right down the side
rib timbers.
Of, there are the rib timbers and the sides. I mean, it would take 100 years to do the excavation that the Almighty did in what, 5 seconds? Oh, and here it is. Oh, this is amazing. This is a shot of a young Ron Wyatt.
Yeah, Ron Wyatt. And you can still see, this is not long after the earthquake, you can still see where it cracked the center down here. Center crack from that outcropping there. But it came all the way from the door area is up here on the starboard side near the bow there, and just kind of ran down there. That also provided him access to the depths. He was able to lower some things down through that crack and take some samples of things. So.
And he brought up some petrified animal dung from way down in the depths of it, which I've handled. I've actually tasted it, and it tastes nothing like petrified animal dung.
Yeah, and here's a piece there.
Oh, there it is.
Coprolite.
It's beautiful. It's like a rabbit or deer. I don't know what it would have been that size, but There it is. That is actually from the ark. Then.
Well, see, that's another issue that people bring up with the whole story itself. How could Noah and 7 other people take care of all these animals? All these multitude of animals, etc. And of course, if I were there, if you were there, you would say, Lord, bring me young animals, that are going to sleep more, they're going to mess less, and smaller. In other words, it didn't take a rocket scientist for anybody to say, I want the small animals. And of course, then after that year of riding around on the boat, once they're let out, they're going to grow and mature. They're going to be strong animals that grow and mature, you see. So yeah, you'd want to have
and being
animals
it would have been relatively dark. It's almost a hibernation chamber.
A hibernation, sure, exactly. So no issues with that at all. Now, this thing's pretty good size. In a lot of Bibles, you'll find a reference that it's 450 feet. People thinking that the Bible mentions 300 cubits. And so, they're thinking, just an 18-inch cubit. And I understand that.
Right, but that's not the cubit that's used in the Bible. I mean, the gates of Gezer, Gezer, and Megiddo all measure out in exactly the 20.62-inch divine cubit. And Solomon was one that built those, and so,
right.
So we're given the dimensions, and this is also called the Royal Egyptian cubit. It's really the divine cubit is what it is. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and actually there are several that have existed in the ancient world, the Royal Egyptian cubit being the one of them. But of course Moses was educated in Egypt. We believe he's the one that wrote the account of Genesis. Mm-hmm. And being educated in Egypt, that would have been the one he was most familiar with. And that's the one he would have used to record the story for us, you see. Mm-hmm.
And that in the Great Pyramid of Giza, that Royal Egyptian cubit is well documented. There's no question of the length of that.
The other thing that Ron eventually realized was that the ship was full of metal. You mentioned earlier last week that they had the ability to fabricate metal, tubal cane, back in Genesis there. And not a lot of folks have really understood that the ship had to survive just a horrendous storm. And so one of the things that was used was huge metal rivets. Let's see if I can find a picture of one. That's just a small piece of one there. And this is a picture here that I'm putting up now of some of the Drogue Stones that we talked about last week. Give you just your viewers an idea how they would have been fashioned. They probably would have been connected one to the other, so it would have been a collective that was moving back and forth. Truly what we have there at the site is we have an ark wreck. I mean, we have a shipwreck there is what we have. And this photo here gives you an idea from some of the radar scans and so forth where the main keels are and how the formation has splayed out. And I know we only have probably just a minute or two left, but maybe in the next segment we could go ahead and talk a little bit more about this splaying, because with the splaying here that you notice, this makes the formation wider than the specifications in the scriptures.
Yeah.
The length, what's amazing to me, having also a construction background, is that the ship landed higher up the ridge, and it was pushed down about 1.5 miles down the ridge to the current location that it's at. And so what's incredible to me is that the length, the integrity of the length, has been precisely maintained. And what that says to me is that these main keels must have been from one solid timber. But of course, we're talking about a ship that's 515 feet long. And so how do you get beams? How do you get wooden beams that are 515 feet long?
Yeah, got to be at least 550 feet long.
For trees.
Yeah.
And some people might, again, think that that's very unusual. But again, the sequoias in California today, they get up to about 350 or so. So it's not out of the realm at all for a pre-flood tree to grow twice that size.
Right. We are back with Jerry Bowen, the director of Anchor Stones International. And Jerry has taken us out to the Anchor Stones, taken us out to the site where Noah's Ark has been found in northern Turkey in the mountains of Ararat. And unlike the armchair critics, he has actually been there more than 30 times, is actively involved in the work that's being done there and the continuing excavation and plans for excavation that's actually planned for this next spring. Jerry, tell us a little bit more about the Noah's Ark.
Okay, all right. We left off in the last segment with talking a little bit about how the ship is a little bit wider. The remains that we find there today are a little bit wider than what the Bible specified. And there's a reason for that. What we believe happened is that the top decks actually collapsed onto the lower decks, and this would have occurred potentially as it came down the mountainside, even though the length was maintained because of the keels. It must have had some shifting and whatnot, and the decks collapsed onto the lower deck. Well, this caused the sides to splay outward, and as you see here in the photo.
And that splaying can account for every bit of the additional width, whereas the stem to stern is exactly in the 20.62 Royal Egyptian or Divine Cubit.
That's correct, Michael. Now, one of the things that we've done, we've had some structural engineers on the site, and when you do a satellite overlay of the formation, and then you go ahead and with your computer place the dimensions that the Bible indicates, you can see how on the right-hand side how it overlays there. Now, what happens is when you then run the degree of splaying, when you look at the way something would fall out, the angle, the arch, what you end up seeing is that it splays out exactly. This is physical data from the site, from a structural engineer, of the splaying is precisely what it should be based on the height of the original walls.
Right.
They just basically fell out.
Because we have all those dimensions in the Scripture.
Right, exactly. So again, it's just another verification that even though people would criticize and say, well, that's not, the 30 cubit wide or 50 cubit wide that the Bible mentions. Once you run the analysis on the splaying aspect, then it actually is the exact figure. In other words, if you put those walls back up, they're going to be 50 cubits in width.
So, hearing the evidences and what you've had to go through as far as these different proofs and the mathematics involved and all, every one of these is because this has been attacked by someone. It can't be because this, can't be because of that. And so every one of these things that you go back to, it comes out with, no, this is the exact proof. If it hadn't splayed out, if it hadn't broken out at this degree, if it hadn't done that, then it would not be as wise as it is now. If it had remained intact, but it didn't remain intact, it's all there. So, we continue to run into this thing, and it reminds me of what Josiah, who was the director of the Israeli Department of Antiquities, which is the Rockefeller Museum. I mean, honestly, that's what it is. They paid for the thing, and Rockefeller wanted to go see it. He wanted to know where all of his money went, but it's a humanist organization. It's a God-rejecting humanist organization. You go through the front door, and they've got artifacts 33,000 years ago from man. Well, that's completely ludicrous, but that's their position. Josiah refused to look at the evidence of Mount Sinai in Arabia, where the Bible says it is, in the ancient land of Midian, refused to look at it. He said, Mount Sinai is a literary invention. It will never be found. He refused to look at it because he had already determined that the Bible is a fairy tale, a literary invention. No one will ever find it, so we're not going to even look at it. And this is what we're dealing with. Most of the world, they want to deny that there is a God. They already have their theology made up, and now we've got to recreate the world and give a different worldview and try to explain how we are here, what life is all about, because there is no God that we ever have to answer to, and we can live by our own fairy tales. And this is the kind of thing that you're having to deal with in these proofs to show that, no, whatever you come up with, whatever scientific thing you think you can use to dismiss this, This is what's coming back and telling us in the real world. The Almighty did interrupt the course of human events, period. Doesn't matter what you want to believe in your fairy tale world of evolution.
Yeah. You always, of course, have your skeptics out there no matter what evidence you reveal to them. Now, I see...
Yeah, I mean, it's, can you imagine demons saying, well, I guess they got us on this one? No. The father of lies will continue to manufacture lies forever.
Yeah. I see it somewhat in a positive light, though, because it really, when the criticism comes, it causes you to really do your homework.
That's true.
You see?
And that 30 times over to this site, huh?
Yeah, I see it somewhat as a positive thing. For even with the accusation that the ship is up on Mount Ararat. I mean, just think about it. For how many centuries now, all of that activity has been going on up there, actually, in a sense, protecting the very obvious location just 20 kilometers away. Mm-hmm. So with all of the interest and activity and digging around and probing around and whatever they were doing up there, they weren't over there doing it to the actual formation. And so, in a sense, that became a positive thing, even though it sends an incorrect message. And we know scientifically, biblically, and even from a common sense standpoint, can you imagine going through a flood of horrific proportions that Noah and the family went through, and then sticking you up on a 17,000-foot mountain and saying, okay, you guys, just get on down any way you can. I mean, it's a treacherous mountain. People die. Most people die that climb mountains coming down, not going up. And, just 1 out of every 10 that climbs Everest, they die on the way down. And so I can't imagine God putting those individuals through that experience and then basically sticking them up on top of a mountain and saying, okay, you haven't been through enough, but now you got to get down. That's to me, that's not common sense. That's not logic. So
it makes a lot of sense, as far as the ark landing up higher, coming down, because as we see, the sediment, the mud flows, everything after the Great Flood, Grand Canyon. I mean, just in a matter of minutes, a Grand Canyon, not like the fairy tale of the Colorado River, millions and millions of years. No, the Colorado River would have to flow uphill in order to carve the Grand Canyon.
Exactly.
No, it's because of the sediment and the flow down through there, you can now see, okay, it's going to carry the ark on down the mountain. It's not going to stay in one spot and come on down. So, some of it could have been at the time of Noah, some of it later that it came down with earthquakes and other things happening. But where it is makes all the sense in the world.
Sure, absolutely. We see here on the screen there, just the top picture there is pretty much what the radar identified in terms of what's actually sitting there, and then the bottom photo is kind of a reconstruction of those splayed walls that would have gone up to the appropriate size. Quite a big ship, actually. This is an interesting shot here. This is a 15-foot model that Ron actually built, and took it out and put it on the river. And put it up, created some waves and that kind of thing. Pretty
Did
interesting.
he utilize the Drogue anchored stone devices in this?
They did put some Drogue stones on there. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so that's when they found that keeps it the prow facing into the waves.
Correct.
And,
Correct.
Oriented correctly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And Ron did some research when he was in Hawaii. He was looking to see, he built kind of a harbor out of just regular rock in the water.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
And then he went ahead and took a floating object to see where it would actually go to and how it would maneuver and so forth. So he was always kind of a hands-on guy. He'd like to experiment with things like that so that he would have some justification for making the conclusions that he came to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I found he did so many practical experiments experiments like that, such as some of the things that he saw in the hieroglyphs down in Egypt. He looked at those and saw that can be made; those very things can be made into a lever system, and so he built a lever system and put a car on it. And two guys raised an entire vehicle up with that very thing that he saw, and the vehicle weighed more than the stones to build the pyramid.
Sure.
So he found exactly how you'd go from one level to building it up just because the images were already there in Egypt. but he had to build it in order to see this. And we saw that it was very practical in many ways like that. It says, this is what it says, this is evidence we have, let's try it out. And so, he basically, everything that he earned in his life, he spent to show that the Bible is true, that it makes sense, it adds up.
Yeah, he invested practically his whole life into this research.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that we want to take a look at, this is when they were over there doing some subsurface radar for one of the television companies in Turkey and for the governor. They had a big ceremony there. During that ceremony of the opening of the visitor center, or not the opening, but I mean the commencement to actually build it, that ceremony, they demonstrated the radar, and Ron showed that just below the surface, a couple of feet below the surface, was just a portion of a deck timber. And so the governor instructed one of the military personnel to go, one of the soldiers, to dig it up, and they dug it up and actually gave it to Ron to take to the States to have it tested. And of course, this is that very timber right here. You see.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that was sitting in his living room when I went to visit him, and that is gopher wood, is it not?
Yeah, the Bible calls it gopher wood, and of course, I've never heard of a gopher tree, right? But so a lot of people speculate as to what the gopher wood really was. And just as the people before the flood had the ability to fabricate metal, they also had the ability to create plywood, to laminate, to make laminated wood. Now, what I brought here, Michael, I just brought a sample. This is a sample of gopher wood. It's just different sections of wood glued together. That's what gopher wood is. It truly means laminated. Okay, and so the deck timbers would be laminated. Now, what do you think the reason for that would be, as compared to, say, a solid beam of this size?
Well, it's going to have far more tensile strength, and that's why you have joist and rafters made on this thing.
Sure,
floor
very good.
Joist and all.
Yeah, it actually would. When you cross the grains, of course, you're doubling the strength, basically, of the pliability and the strength of that board. So a lot more durable to do. And so it's just interesting that, again, the Lord would instruct Noah, the master builder, to use that kind of process instead of a solid piece of wood.
Yeah.
Now,
we see this, as far as the technology. It was Josephus said that the Great Pyramid of Giza, first of all, wasn't built by the Egyptians. There's no evidence that the Egyptians were involved in that at all.
Right.
In fact, they built pyramids much later than that collapsed. They built them at the wrong angle and all.
Correct.
But the Great Pyramid of Giza, he said, existed before the flood, and that it was covered with polished limestone, and the cement that they used to put it together, it was poured vertically 1/50,000th of an inch, the width of a business card.
Right.
And when they were taking this out and removing the facing stones on it, which is just polished like a mirror, that they actually broke the stone because they couldn't break the cement that was used.
Yeah,
they have no idea what it was. And so the cement that they had back then is superior to anything that we've come up with today. And gophering or laminating back then, this again before the flood, and putting together the wood in a floating structure, they were geniuses. They were all geniuses compared to where we are today.
Yeah, we'll have to do a show one time on the pyramids, because I don't find many people that have your perspective, which is the perspective. I have the same perspective, that the Giza Plateau, there's a whole complex, and it was pre-flooded development. And there are certain reasons why it had to be. Primarily because of the environment and the alignment and so forth.
Right, yeah, well, to discuss the erosion patterns on the Sphinx, which are water erosion, not wind erosion. And, it's a fascinating study, but, it goes back before the flood, which is
and the
your
Sphinx,
particular forte.
Yeah, the Sphinx may have even been added later. I don't think that was a part of the original. But then again, there are reasons for that. But anyway, get back to this. One thing I wanted to point out about this, since I have it sitting here, is you can probably easily see the rings in this wood. Okay? And the science of dendrochronology is, of course, counting the rings of trees. People will cross-section a tree, and they'll count the rings, and they'll get an estimated year, an estimated age of that particular tree. And actually, it's not totally accurate because the rings are not annual rings, as a lot of people think.
Wet season, dry season.
Wet season, dry season.
Yep.
Okay, so you may have more than one of those in a year, a solar year.
Yeah.
So it's just actually registering that kind of thing. However, so what that means is when you go into Genesis again and you rely on Scripture to give us the insight in terms of the environment, we find that we didn't have the wet, dry seasons like we do today. In fact, the Bible even goes so far to say it never rained. Okay, so what that means is that the wood, the grain of the wood, pre-flood wood, would look much different than this. You wouldn't see the rings in pre-flood wood. You would have a grain. It might resemble the grain of stone or something, but you wouldn't have the rings because you didn't have those those extremes and seasonal changes. That means that somebody came to you and said, Michael, I got a piece of wood from Noah's Ark. Right? Obviously, the ark was built pre-flood. Okay, so using pre-flood material, it'd be quite a trick to use post-flood material on the but at any rate, if somebody brought a piece of wood to you and said, Michael, this is a piece of wood from Noah's Ark, you'd be able to look at it in 10 seconds. You would be able to verify whether it was or not, because when you look at this sample, this on the screen here, you find that it doesn't have the rings.
Right.
Okay, it doesn't have the rings in it.
And I handled that piece and looked at it very carefully. No indication of rings whatsoever, but you could definitely see the different layers in it.
Correct.
And that was the piece that was actually dug up by the command of the governor. Okay, we see it. You go dig it up, and Ron, you have it analyzed, and they cut through this with a stone saw and to reveal the pattern that we see.
Exactly. One of the things that Ron did, actually it's interesting, he did this by hand. Usually when you have a core drilling machine, it's a machine that does all the work, but he took a hand drilling machine in to do this in the side of the ship. And this revealed some very interesting things as well.
Now this is through the side of the ship rather than from the top down.
Through the side, that's correct. And one of the things, of course, was some animal hair. I think you maybe had mentioned that. Yeah. Animal hair. And then, of course, the coprolite that he mentioned you find there. Even
coprolite, which is
the fossilized animal dung. Animal dung. And then fossilized broken antlers and things of this nature. And smaller stuff, which is what you would expect to find if the animals were infants or relatively young at that point. So in other words, everything that we would expect to find on a floating zoo is what really has been found there. And I'm wondering if this picture here, you can't probably make the detail out in this too significantly. The reason I wanted to show this was because Greater Ararat and Lesser Ararat are volcanoes. There's a lot of volcanic activity in this area, a lot of seismic activity. When you look at the lava flow, when you look at the recent eruptions and the lava demes and so forth, you can't really probably see it. Maybe they can on the screen there, but when you look at the lava field here, these lava cliffs were cut off pretty abruptly. In other words, lava will flow and it'll level out to a certain extent as it cools. But if something would stop it, it would build up high cliffs. It would just keep building up into a high cliff. And these cliffs down here are actually 100, 150 feet high. Okay, they don't look at it because you're 7,000 feet up in the mountains, but they're actually, you go stand down there, they're 100 feet, 150 feet up in the air. What that tells us is that as the lava came down, it would typically keep going unless something stopped it, right? And what stopped it was the water, all the water that was in the valley there. You see, the lava came down, hit the water, and started to build up because it cooled rapidly. So what this tells us that the whole area was filled with water at one time prior to the eruptions. So the flood first, and then after, you see. So this, again, it creates another time clock for us when we start looking around at the geology of the area.
This is not the only place that you have done work. You have also been to Israel. You've been to the site recognized as Gomorrah. This is a place, one of my popular hangouts, living just 2 hours north of there. But tell us a little bit of your experience there, because I think what we're going to have to do in the future, we want to hear from you out there, because if you want to hear more about this, I would really like to go with Jerry down to the Giza Plateau and to hear his insights on that. We've got Sodom and Gomorrah, we've got the Red Sea crossing, and then we finally get to his forte, which is the secret of the Ark and the location of the Ark of the Covenant, which we've talked about quite a bit. If you want more, ladies and gentlemen, we need to hear from you, okay? Call in, write in, let us know what you want on this thing. But I want to hear a little bit about your experience over there in Gomorrah and what, your viewpoint on this.
Okay. Would it be okay if I get to that in just a second? I wanted to come back. What we've looked at thus far is we've looked at a lot of physical evidence. And we've even looked at a lot of circumstantial evidence, like the Drogue Stones are circumstantial, the altar sites, and there are more than one altar site. Actually, there are altar sites also up in the mountains here, which is where the family would have stayed initially when getting out of the boat. Actually, up here close to the border area, just above this ridge here, the picture on the screen, just above that ridge.
That's a high ridge right at the skyline.
Right at the skyline. Just over that ridge is Iran. You're going into Iranian territory. Okay.
Oh, we are right on the edge.
You're right on the edge of the Iranian. Actually, that's about a mile and a half up. Doesn't look like it, but on the ground, it's about a mile and a half up there. At any rate, we've looked at the physical evidence. We've looked at the circumstantial evidence. Something is equally valuable to me and significant is the spiritual significance. I had a group of Kiwis from New Zealand on a tour one year, and we were actually standing or just seated back here on the stern, taking a little break. The sun was lowering a little bit. We were having a time to just get some water and whatnot, and I wanted to really explain to them. I wanted them to catch a vision of how important the spiritual significance was, and to do that, all I had to do was direct their attention up the hill and point out the original landing area. You can pretty much look up the hill and see between ridges, where there's a little harbor up there. In fact, the first time I was there, Michael, I actually just dropped to my knees because it was so like our Heavenly Father to make such a wonderful harbor of safety. And there I was standing right in the middle of it. But what I wanted to share with these guys is that, this thing, because it's impaled here on the side, it means it slid down to this location. All right. So it was up higher. It was about a mile and a half further up the ridge before sometime it slid down. It was broken free by a pyroclastic blast, more than likely, and the lahar and the mud and the lava and all just washed it down. It hit this outcrop and it was impaled. Okay. And then, of course, the mud and all kept coming, and it was buried for a while. We don't know how long, but that would have accelerated the fossilization process. Yeah. And then at the appropriate time, it was brought forth after an earthquake. And I was explaining this to these guys, and then I asked them, what have I just described? This boat was a symbol of salvation. I mean, it literally not only saved Noah and his family, but all the rest of humanity as well. Right. So, but what have I just described in what's happened to it? Well, our Savior came down from an elevated place from heaven. It was the sin of this world, of course, his love that brought him down here. But he came down in a sinful world, and as an innocent man, he was put on a cross, he was impaled in the side, he was buried, and he came forth after an earthquake. That is astounding to me. That's incredible. That the very same thing that our Lord would go through, occurred with this. The very same thing. See, that's part of that evidence. See, that's powerful evidence to me. And to any Christian, that ought to be the most overwhelming evidence that this indeed, God has his fingerprint all over this. You know what I mean? Yeah. And so it's fantastic.
Well, Jerry, this has been great. And, you know, I'm really looking forward to what we can do in the future on this. Again, if you want to dig deeper into this, let us know on this. But, you know, one thing is the physical evidence, but what Jerry and I were speaking about last night and spending a good bit of time on is not just the physical evidence, because once you grasp that, once you see what the Creator has put in the earth as a testimony in this day and time, then the rest of the story all begins to make sense. From Genesis 1:1 to Revelation 22:21, it is all one story. It is His story,
Amen.
History, and His story is still being told, and the greatest story never told is being brought forth to the world, because today the rocks are crying out.
Absolutely.
Jerry, thanks so much for being with us, and
pleasure.
we'll look forward to Jerry being back with us again. This is Michael Rood bidding you shalom, peace. Have a good week. We'll see you back here next week with our new series on Shabbat Night Live. See you then. Shalom.